Welcome back to the Low Man Help podcast. We are joined today for the second time by our very special guest, Neil Paine, formerly of 538, formerly of the Atlanta Hawks, currently of the wonderful Neil Paine Substack. Neil, welcome to the pod.
Hey, Mark. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you here. It's not all the time that we get somebody in the upper echelon of the numbers game. Like you're the I'm always writing down percentiles for pick and roll. You're the top 1 percentile.
Wow.
You're the 99th percentile in our brain power that we can pull. So thanks for coming back.
I appreciate you saying that. I'm not sure that's accurate, but I'll just I won't fact check you too hard on that.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Subtle. You're so humble. All right. So we're here. You've got the NBA forecast model. You've been having it second year in a row. You've had it running. You've had the Raptor model running, and the forecast model we checked in earlier in the year. You do 2 composites. You do composite stats with Vegas, and then you also do stats only. And you run this model, just as a refresh to anybody that didn't hear the first one, you run this model of a Monte Carlo theory, which I had to get. I had to get the details from you on like what that actually was, the simulation of thousands of rounds of games, and how much data goes into the model for you. How historical is it?
Well, this one was based on, I think I was looking back to like 2010 or something. And to me, I'm curious to get your take on this, because I do feel like there was sort of a split in eras of the NBA around that, like, in the late 2000s, early 2010s, where, and we may have talked about this on the last episode that I was on, but my whole impetus for this model was to try to keep things like a separate playoff track from the regular season, because I was finding that using the regular season to predict the playoffs was becoming less effective. And I think that started around 2010. I don't know if that tracks with you and your perception of things, but like there was a time in which you could just use the regular season, because I think the players, they were just like, I'm getting paid for this game, getting paid for playoff games. I'm just going to, kind of treat them the same. And we didn't have the same level of, load management or just strategic kind of thinking around the big picture of the season. And now we do have that. And I feel like that started to come into the 2010s. So that was why I started using that data, I think around 2010, to kind of train the model in the past and try to figure out what is the weight that you put on a regular season game when trying to predict the playoffs, when you have a track record for a team in previous playoffs and things like that, which I think we went deep on last time.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you weight in the model, you weight previous year's playoff games 3x compared to regular season games, correct?
Yeah, for future playoff, like when predicting like this year's playoffs, last year's playoffs would get a lot more weight. Now, there's a recency factor as well, so it's not strict in that regard. But generally speaking, those would get a lot more weight than this year's regular season, which can, if there's player movement and things like that or injuries, it can kind of be it can make the model worse. But generally speaking, based on what we've seen in the NBA over the years, I don't want to say the regular season doesn't matter at all, but it matters less when trying to predict things. And I'm sure we'll then go on the rest of this episode to talk about how good these teams will look during the regular season, because it's exciting. It's one of those things where, like, however many months ago, 5 months ago, and think of teams roughly the same way with maybe a little alteration based on what we've seen of them. We like the fact that these games are happening all the time. We're getting new data and getting, the eye test on these teams and everything. But it is true that predictively, if you're trying to kind of figure out how to predict the playoffs of this year, you do want to put more weight on like last year's playoffs than you do on the games we've seen so far, which is kind of crazy. It's different from other sports.
Yeah, I completely agree. So to get into it, your model, I'm going to talk about the composite model, because I think it's interesting to have the Vegas odds baked in, because Vegas knows what they're doing as well. And their odds are baked into your composite model, where you're consistently using what's happening on the court and then what Vegas believes will happen, because they're good at that out there. So let's start in the East. And I think the easiest way to kind of pose these, we talked about this before, is like there are 2 heavy favorites in each conference to come out of it. So Boston in your model, in the composite model, has a 55% chance to come out of the East and make the finals.
Well, 65.
65. Oh wow, I'm really off on
The
this. I had them
Thunder are
backwards.
55.
I had it backwards. Okay, so
Yeah.
in your composite
I
model,
said I
great.
wouldn't fact check. Sorry.
So in the East, Boston has a 65.5% chance to come out of the East and make the finals. Would you rather have Boston or the field in the East?
Well, I think by definition, you'd rather have the 65. And I think that that's reflected. So you mentioned the Vegas odds being part of that. If you look at FanDuel and kind of dejuice the odds of each team winning the conference, they have 54%. So it's like a little bit high. The stats are a little bit higher on Boston than the pure betting odds, but they would also take Boston against the field in that. And then it's similar, like depending on whether you look at the stats or the betting odds, that it's like Cleveland is around, half of that or some such, and then it falls off a cliff into the single digit odds in there. And so, yeah, I would take Boston. I'm curious what your take is on it.
What do you like about them? Because I think there's stuff to like about them, and I can dive into it. But what do you like about them of what you've seen of their kind of makeup this year?
Well, I mean, we've already seen them win. That's a little reductive, but I mean, we've seen them be able to do it. They had one of the best seasons, I think, beginning to end, just overall, top to bottom of all time last year. And you see that pattern, and they haven't really fallen off. I mean, I guess if you look at net rating, they're not historic like they were last year. They're third in the league during the regular season, so that's behind OKC and Cleveland. But they're still, like a +9 team net rating wise during the regular season. There's a tendency for teams, and we saw this with the Warriors. If you think back to 2015, they had a better net rating in their first year that they won the championship, the 2015 team, than in the year where they broke the wins record the following season. They didn't have more wins, but they had a higher net rating, which is kind of a, better indicator of just like how dominant you are. And we see this time and again where a team will have like a really dominant year. They'll win their first championship for a particular core. And then they'll, I don't know if it's take their foot off the gas or just do a little more of that experimenting like we're just talking about, or just like it's tough to sustain that focus. They had a long summer. There was an Olympics coming off of last season as well. It's super tough to maintain that level of dominance and focus for another whole season. And maybe we brought them up last time I was on as well. But think about the 2000 and the 2001 Lakers. The 2000 Lakers were a team like the Celtics were last year, where they came together. It was the right mix of like Kobe and Shaq were hitting their peak. And it's just one of the best seasons beginning to end in NBA history. The following season, they're like a little bit above average, but they're not amazing during the regular season by any stretch of the imagination. And then, of course, in the playoffs, they just almost go undefeated and just completely dominate that.
Here's my only thing with Boston. And it's not my only thing, but it's my biggest thing. I got a few things with them. And you're right, it has looked like they've taken their foot off the gas a little. And one of the things that concerned me, and you brought it up, was there has been this stretch that these guys are on. And you brought up two things that are interesting. The Shaq and Kobe first year and the Warriors first year, right? And I think those are interesting because those came at the beginning of huge playoff runs, right? This Boston championship is coming kind of in the middle / the end of this massive playoff burden of games mixed in with 2 Olympic tournaments for a lot of their guys. So if you think about it from, Eastern Conference finals against the Warriors, finally this breakthrough, like at this point, since the weird December start in 2021, Tatum's played 68 playoff games and 2 Olympic tournaments. Brown's played 63 playoff games. White's played 62 playoff games and 1 Olympic tournament. Holiday's played 59 playoff games and 2 Olympic tournaments. They've played a ton of extra games, whereas the teams you're talking about, they didn't have that big workload on them on the front end of this big run. And the other ones,
that's a great point.
Yeah, the other ones you've seen, I went back and looked over like a 5-year stretch recently. Miami played 87 playoff games. They came out of it with 4 trips to the finals and 2 trophies. Golden State played 110 over a 5-year stretch. They came out of it with 3 trophies and 5 trips to the finals. Cleveland, when LeBron went there, played 81 playoff games in those 4 stretches and 1 title, 4 trips to the finals. So like those stretches all came at the championship came at the start, or that was the beginning of them. Where this Boston one, it feels like it's kind of at the tail end of that big run of games. And I just wonder is that attrition going to catch up to this team? Because a lot of the stuff you've seen, injuries or kind of slippage or, some of it just doesn't look as crisp. It's not so much that it's like a data thing to me, but like when you watch them, it just doesn't look as crisp. It doesn't look as like they're getting this one advantage and then compounding it. And some of that might be that teams they have 1 year of film on this iteration that has Porzingis and Drew Holiday, whereas they didn't have any film on it before. I think Cleveland plays them really well. I think Cleveland has done some like funky things where they've just said, you know what, we're going to switch everything on the perimeter. And if you want to shoot ISO threes with your guys, that's no problem. None of those guys are James Harden. We will live with Mobley guarding on the perimeter. We will live with Allen guarding on the perimeter. We're not going to crack our defensive shell just because you bring somebody up. And I think that teams giving another year of film plus this big attrition of all these extra games, I could see it catching up with them this year.
That's a great point because I'd done a thing where I looked at the most wins in the playoffs in any like 8-year span by a team that didn't win the championship. And the Celtics before last season had won 63, which was the second most ever behind only the 93 to 2000 Knicks, because of course they would be that team. And if they hadn't won, they would have been number one. They would have had over 70 playoff wins without a championship. So that is different among that group. But at the same time, you'd rather have Tatum going through all that workload and still be 26, I guess is what I'm saying. Or Jaylen Brown's still 28. Pritchard, continues to improve. He's still, just in his prime. So I think they're like less old than they seem based on how much we've seen them or whatever. But I know it's also not the make, it's the mileage in a lot of cases. And they've played a ton of games, meaningful games. Over
just the mental load that takes is like quite considerable. And I think a lot of this comes from, I like some of the stuff that, I don't think Indiana or Milwaukee's coming out, but I think either one of them could get them in a series. Like I think they're funky enough to get them. I don't think New York is really a threat to any of these teams, but to me, it's always Cleveland. And what Cleveland's doing in terms of how they're using Mitchell and Garland to not only initiate offense, but play off of each other, I absolutely love. I dug into some of their pick and roll stuff. In terms of volume ball handlers this year for pick and roll action, so like top 100 guys, this is sorted by second spectrum. Garland is third in points per direct. Mitchell is fourth, and Ty Jerome is sixth. So like they're just knocking it out of the park. And in terms of screeners for the same thing, Mobley is fifth and Jared Allen is sixth. So like they have this cohesive unit that knows how to move together, and their strengths complement their partner's strengths. And I think they have a little bit of that magic that Boston had last year where you didn't have the film on it. Even though you've seen this group together, you didn't have the film of quite how they're moving everything around. And I really like them in a playoff setting. They seem to have had Boston's number this year so far.
Yeah, and they might be, to your point about like the teams that make the leap, they would definitely be this year's version of that in terms of teams that were not really on the radar as being this good. But I think with Cleveland, it's more like you can explain it by, like you talked about the injuries, the guys are missing, just the personnel combinations that they had. So I do think that if they're on a collision course, we're going to go back and we're going to look at those first 3 games of that series last year and think about how that series was probably a lot closer than the 5-game result made it seem. And then we're going to think about how much better Cleveland is this year.
Yeah. There's something about Atkinson weaponizing Mobley in terms of they're encouraging him to shoot. And I don't think the shooting is the thing that's putting him over the top, but I love that he doesn't get discouraged by misses. He's only attempting a little bit over 3 a game, but in the fourth quarter of that Boston game, the latest one they played, he absolutely dominated the fourth quarter. And him being able to shoot the ball, him shooting in the trail, him being able to attack, when they switched the pick and roll, he went and posted White and got a bucket. There's nothing that he can't do offensively in the pick and roll action. He's a lob threat. He can space the floor. He can play in the pocket. He can finish in the pocket. He can post up smaller guys, and especially the Boston one, because I don't know where you can hide Porzingis when they play Cleveland, because Porzingis thrives off not being in the actual pick and roll action, not being in 2-man action. He thrives off being able to be in the back like this condor with all the length, being able to cover up mistakes. And I don't know that you can put him somewhere where you can hide him the way that Cleveland plays, and Cleveland switching on defense and just not cracking their shell. I think they're a really tough matchup, and I desperately want to see that series at full strength.
Yeah, me too. And I think that's one that we're all kind of like circling on the calendars. Like it would be pretty disappointing if we don't get that.
Well, I want to see it. Is there any team, before we move on to the West, is there any team that you think has a puncher's chance to get out of the East other than those two?
Well, you kind of dismissed them out of hand, so I feel a little bad bringing up the Knicks in this. But and I know that they've like not looked like that as much recently. But I keep waiting for them to have a breakthrough. Like, could they at least get past Indiana in the playoffs? Can we just have that happen? But at the same time, I there was a time during the season, like early in the season, and that's another topic of debate as to like if you had to break the regular season into segments, what would be the most predictive. And I think early season results, when teams are kind of healthy, especially if it's the group that they're going to end up having by the playoffs as well, those I think tend to be I'm calling back on memory of conversations I had with my old colleague Ben Morris back in the day, but I think he said like early in the season there was more predictability to a team than like the middle of the season or whenever the Knicks have been, struggling a little bit and hit a lull. So to me, when this team was at its best, it seemed like it was at least going to make life tough for teams. Some of those top teams, I don't know that they could beat them 4 times in 7 games.
Yeah.
But I still I love Jalen Brunson. I just love that team. Like, it's a bunch of guys that I really love. And not just because they all went to Villanova.
I was going to say, you're a Philly guy. Yeah. Like, you're obligated. Don't you sign a contract in blood when you're in Philly that I will ride or die for every single Philly person ever?
Well, yeah, Philly people now, it's debatable as to whether Nova fully counts it. They're out on the main line. They're not in town. But yeah, I think in general, you just have a soft spot. I mean, that was an easy team. Well, maybe not for you, but an easy team for some of us to root for. But anyway, I do think that Brunson is just the type of player that you want on your side in a playoff series. That guy is going to give you everything he's got, and he's going to do everything he can to kind of, make the other team miserable, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. So I'll give you a quick on the Knicks, because they're obviously one of those tentpole teams in the NBA and people love them. So I would push back on one thing about early season only, or not push back, but give one caveat. When you have a team, and we talked about this with Cleveland this year and kind of Boston the year before, when you have a team that has a new element that the league hasn't seen before, I think it takes a little while for the film to get out and the coverages to kind of pick up of like, hey, how are we going to guard this? So like early in the year, the Knicks were just spamming the Cat Brunson pick and roll.
Oh yeah, we did write about that.
Yeah, they were just spamming it. And so like every month the points per possession has gone down, because all of a sudden the league was guarding it to start with their same 5 men guarding, Cat. And it was something that was having trouble. And now we've seen smaller guys guard Cat, stash the 5 on Josh Hart. You can rotate out of the first tag to Cat and make him a playmaker. And all this stuff wasn't on film yet. It wasn't stuff that had been tried. And the Knicks were really feasting on that early on. And now, even if you filter all the pick and roll combinations down enough, because teams have started to do this, put their 5 on Josh Hart, Brunson Hart is actually the top points per possession combination of pick and roll combinations. So that pick and roll feast, because all of a sudden you're getting Hart running downhill 4-on-3, because you have to bring 2 to the level of the ball for Brunson. So I like Jalen Brunson. I love Jalen Brunson. He's phenomenal with his feet. He's one of those guys that's easy to root for because he's not an outlier athletically. But in terms of what they can create offensively and the shot quality that they can get, they're just a cut below everybody else when it comes to actual contenders. So while I would love to see like real serious basketball in the Garden, I don't know that we get it past the first 2 rounds. All right, so let's go to the West. All right, OKC out in the West, they're at 55% to make it to the finals. So a little less of a favorite than Boston in the East, but still Vegas would take them or your model would take them over the field. They're right now first in net rating, 12.5, fourth in offensive rating, 18.5, first in defensive rating, 106 points. They're an absolute juggernaut regular season wise. They have proven that they have a formula and they know how to kick ass when it comes to regular season. So would you like OKC or would you like the field in the West?
I mean, this is a really, really tough one. This is a lot tougher, I mean, for me than the Boston one in the East, because there's so many good options that you could take. If you take the field, I mean, you get Luka Lakers, you get Jokic, you get the Warriors that have, the Jimmy Butler Warriors coming on strong, the Grizz still waiting to kind of see what they can do in the playoffs. I'm like really tempted. I know you and I have these reputations as like, I'm the ride or die SGA guy. You're the SGA hater. So I hesitate to go against type on that. And also there's the factor of, I wasn't surprised that OKC lost in the playoffs early last year, because they would have been one of the least experienced playoff teams ever to make a deep run into the playoffs in terms of previous games or minutes in the playoffs for their core. They have more experience this year. I don't know if it's a lot more. They'd still probably be one of the youngest teams and one of the most inexperienced. But all of which is say, yeah, I do think I'm taking the field, but it's so close. It's like 49-51 or something in my mind. But what do you think, Mark?
You're right. Like there's too many juicy options in the field. Like your model and everything right now, it doesn't have enough stats on the back end baked in of what the Luka Lakers are, but the Luka Lakers are scary. Like you love that. Jokic is terrifying. The model has that at about 12.7% for them to come out of the West. Minnesota with Anthony Edwards, like he can be the best player in any series he steps into. He was the best player in a series with Jokic. Like they beat the Nuggets in game 7 on the road, down 20 in the second half. Like they have about an 8% chance to come out of the West in your model. Like there's too many good options out there, whereas the East just felt like you're picking Boston or Cleveland almost.
I think that's right. Yeah. Or, outside glance at the Knicks or the Bucks or whatever. I mean, the fact that the Pistons are even potentially in that conversation, the field conversation, nothing against them, because they're an amazing story and it's been incredible to watch. But like, I don't think we think they're coming out of the East. Whereas you could go that deep into the West, and you would still find teams where it's like, I don't know, I'd give the Rockets a thought. I'd give teams a second glance or whatever in there.
Yeah.
So I do think that, I like your comment about the juicy options in there. And it's not anything against the Thunder. It's just like they have to be able to be ready for all of these different teams. The West is going to be the playoff bracket in the West is going to be, I think, insane.
Oh, it'll be
especially to your point. I mean, Luka, we're still very early in the Lakers integrating him in, and he's already shown pretty rapid acclimation, in just a very short, I'm trying to look up how many games it's even been since then.
That will go down as one of the dumbest basketball moves ever made. There is no justification.
I hate it. Nine games, by the way.
Yeah.
I mean, I hated it from the second that I saw it, of course. And like everybody else, couldn't believe that it was true. And I still call me a conspiracy guy or whatever, but I think that there's so much more going on there than we are privy to. It reminded me a little bit of remember when the Celtics, they suspended Ime Udoka, and when people were like, oh, what's going on there? Why did that happen? They were like, don't worry about it. No, it's totally just because he broke a team rule. Don't ask too many questions. We're just going to take the coach of the year, the coach from the finals team, and we're going to suspend him for a year. We're not firing him. We're suspending him for a year, and you're never going to know why, the real reason why. To me, that's like there's smoke and, wherever there's smoke, there's fire. And I think there's a lot of that with this, like Nico Harrison's explanations just struck me as being like,
you're not buying any of it.
Did he ask ChatGPT to come up with hey, what's up? Hey, so I just traded Luka for pennies on the dollar. How would I explain that to the media? And ChatGPT is like, well, you can talk about defense winning champions. Yeah, that's good. Cool. I'll talk about that. So anyway, I just can't stand what that means also, because it's like such I think a betrayal of those fans, but then also a betrayal of the competitive spirit of the game if we're having trades that are happening for utterly non-basketball reasons that we don't even know what the actual rationale was, and then they're trying to kind of feed us some kind of bullshit excuse. Anyway, that's my soapbox rant about it. But good for the Lakers.
LeBron and JJ Redick have obviously a mutual respect, and he has given him license to say the true things to him and for them to have an open line of communication to talk. Luka, obviously the same way. JJ had a whole press conference about, like, I asked him, like, how do you want to be coached? Like, am I free to say, whatever I feel is necessary to get the best out of you? And he says, yes, like I want to be coached hard. So like, he's been teammates with these guys. He's done a podcast with the other. He has a certain rapport with them where he can say the true things. He can say the things that other coaches maybe didn't have the license to actually say to the players. They said them in the coaches meeting, but they didn't actually say them to the players. And you're right about the Lakers. Like, just get the guy and then figure it out later. And they're the best team in the world at doing that. They just get the guy and they're like, we'll figure everything else later. And they figured this out really, really quickly, it looks like.
Yeah, and I felt like I'm glad you talked about the dynamic between Luka and LeBron, because I always thought that people were like, how are they going to play together? There's only one ball. It's like, okay, well, LeBron can literally do like any role. He can perform any role that is required, and he's not going to have a problem fitting in with them. And the other person that I was like, I love this for is Austin Reeves, because all of a sudden he kind of doesn't have to, like, he was doing sort of a poor man's version of the Luka, of like play with LeBron, be that guy that sometimes initiates, sometimes plays off ball and shoots and does those things. And he's a great player, but if you unleash him to kind of be more of an efficiency maximizing player with these other two all-time great distributors playing with him, it's going to unlock his game. And his true shooting percentage is up 40 points since the last time, since the trade happened. So to me,
oh my God,
this is like such a scary iteration of the team. And I say that as someone that has consistently just like rolled my eyes at Lakers exceptionalism and all this stuff.
It's real.
Like and there's like Lakers exceptionalism to their perception sometimes. So like, a few years ago, everybody was like, or maybe the canonical example of this is like the Steve Nash, Dwight Howard, like it's like, oh, the Lakers are going to win the championship, baby. And then, they struggle to make the playoffs and get run out in the first round. Then there's like that LeBron team a handful of years ago with like Westbrook, where they are just a complete disaster and people refuse to accept it. But then there's also Lakers exceptionalism of like when they legitimately are good and there's just nothing you can do about it.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the version that we're getting now, or will get potentially in the playoffs. And that's why I want to see him play OKC for sure in the playoffs. I want to see Denver because I feel like we've almost, with all the Luka talk and then OKC, kind of continuing their ascent, teams like Houston, some of the kind of like rising teams, the flashy new, like shiny objects that we have to kind of occupy ourselves with, because, it's a long regular season and there's only so many things to talk about, that we like perpetually forget about Denver, except like when Jokic has some kind of insane game where we're like, oh yeah, that guy is like the best player on the planet. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
But otherwise, we sometimes forget about them, which is very weird. But like, if they're, if they have their guys and Jokic, is feeling good, I don't see why they can't make another run. For sure.
12.7% to come out of the West. I think when I think about Denver, I was actually talking to Adam Mares the other day, and he asked me like what I think about the Boston game. And since the Lakers game, like this kind of funnel strategy that's always existed. Minnesota did it, their own version of it with Jokic. The Lakers just added, a version of like, we're going to front him at all times with smaller guys, but we're still going to kind of like sag off, selective people, the Roberson rule for Westbrook and Gordon, and make these guys beat us. And I think, I told Adam, like, when I look at the difference between a Nuggets championship and like a really exceptional Jokic team, like because Jokic is pulling them, it's the Boston game. And not that Christian Brown isn't amazing. He's really good at what he does. But like I told him, like, if you're looking at the lineups, like if you take Christian out and you put KCP there, and if you take Westbrook out and you put Bruce Brown there, and what that shooting looks like spacing wise, what that playmaking looks like, all these other things, like the margins of winning a championship are so small. And like those two things, those are the things that make the difference. Like if you can have somebody that draws, a few extra feet of space for Jokic, if you have somebody that can actually like not turn the ball over at a high rate when they're ripping and running or cutting or anything like that, like those small details, I feel like that's the thing that just makes me not want to lean all into them. But you're absolutely right. Like he's one of a kind, and there's almost no problem that if he gets into a series, he's not going to figure out how to at least solve. Now, if shots go in or not, that's a totally different story. But you're not going to he's not going to be presented with a defense that's unsolvable to him. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, and if they can get Aaron Gordon and some of these other guys, consistently back, it's not going to be the same team because, like you were just saying, the team that won the championship, they had better role players. But I like Christian Braun's development. That's the other thing is like he didn't have to become, this kind of really efficient complementary player to Jokic. Like that wasn't guaranteed.
I love him. He's great, and he knows exactly what he's supposed to do with Jokic. Like he's set an inverted pick and rolls for Jokic. Like he knows that I'm not supposed to be popping, I'm diving these. Like I'll slip out of them. Like he cuts really well. He's always in the right spot. He's a super hard-nosed defender. There's just a few, and he shot 8 threes. Like I'm glad that he shot them. There were just a few where he turned down to either pass it or go into, like there was one in the second quarter where he turns it down to shoot a pull-up too. Even though he makes it, like those are the ones that you just think like, all right, there's one little extra layer that kind of like puts you over the top and gives Jokic all the space where he's completely unsolvable, and like unsolvable in a way where it's like really hitting on all cylinders. And it just feels like they're just one little gear away from that. That's what it feels like.
Yeah. I wonder if they can get that. It's probably a little late in the season to do that. But again, Braun is, he's one of the most improved players in the league, certainly over the past couple seasons. So maybe there's still like room for him to grow. But I know you and I have talked about how that's more of an off-season thing.
So one more thing on OKC, because I wouldn't be shocked if they come out of the West. I really wouldn't. I wouldn't put them as I'd take them over the field, but I wouldn't be shocked. Over the past 2 weeks, their first defensive rating has dropped to 21st. Now, Chet's come back. Daigneault has been on the record of they're trying different things. They've been this juggernaut. So for somebody that's been inside looking at the numbers, there's 2 things that I'm really curious about. One, the age-old adage, and it's been documented, the pace slows down in the playoffs, right? So that's guaranteed. But will their turnover differential decrease or come closer? Because right now they turn everybody over more than anybody in the league, and they also don't turn it over as much. And I think they get so much of their offense, off getting rebound to run or turnover to run and getting all these extra buckets where they don't have to play against the set defense. And so like when you think about your time or wherever you stand on this issue, do you think that, I think they're about +6 right now, do you think that will shrink back? And if it shrinks back, like how big of a problem is that for them?
Yeah, well, I haven't quite seen, or I'm trying to remember whether I've seen research on whether like turnover rate, changes during the playoffs. I have a sense that like we know offensive efficiency dips, so it may well be that turnovers are kind of like easier to force, but they're also easier to commit. And we also know the pace goes down, in which case, you're getting fewer of those transition opportunities off of those live ball, type of starts to the play. So I'm not really sure. I mean, that's an interesting point that you made. And then the other thing about the defense in the middle of the season, that's one where, it's like February and March. I don't know how much to read into, fluctuations like that in the span, because they're still, I mean, they are the best defense even after that downturn over the whole season by almost 3 whole points per 100 over Orlando. Orlando's at 109.6. OKC is at
they're outerworldly. They're so far away.
So they
from
had room to
else.
give up, plenty of ground on defense and still be the best in the league. So that one I'm not as concerned about. But in terms of the playing style, I mean, that is a great point about how they're like a football. We made the Belichick analogy earlier, but that was what those Patriots teams thrived off of, was turnover differential.
Yeah.
And that's like an underrated aspect of a basketball team, is you don't make mistakes and they do make mistakes. You're going to have a lot more what they call you're going to have fewer 0 point possessions, because a turnover is a guaranteed 0 point possession. Any play where you don't get a shot up, even if it's a bad
Not
shot.
good.
Well, yeah, right, exactly. Even if you get a bad shot up, it still has some probability of actually giving you points, whereas a
Yeah.
turnover gives you 0 by definition.
So I'm curious about that one. That one's one that's really curious to me because I think that's a big deal in terms of like bumping up the numbers for their offense, for their net rating, all these other things. And then the other one that I really enjoy about them that they didn't have last year, and one of the reasons I'm lower on the Knicks, is Isaiah Hartenstein. And
Oh, you love him.
I love everything he does on the court. Like a big that knows exactly what they're doing in terms of passing reads when they're playing advantage basketball, a big that can go first to second side or second to third side with a quick DHO into something else. There's nothing that's more devastating than being able to run your offense at a fast and intelligent speed from every single position. And he gives them that. And it's one of the things that I really enjoy the most about this iteration of the Thunder compared to the previous one. Because while I love Jalen Williams, the backup big from Arkansas, and I love Chet, he's fun, I just think that they didn't have this element. And there's something about his quick DHO game, his playmaking in the pocket, and truly a toughness that he brings, not only on the defensive end, but the offensive glass, that I just think it's a different element they didn't have. And I'm intrigued to see it in a series.
And I was gratified by hearing that you're so high on him, because he's usually the kind of archetype of player, especially like, big, coming from the Knicks, going to a different team, that if they had good stats, especially, that maybe the numbers are a little too high on compared with more of like a coaching eyes view or a scouting eyes view. So I was like, oh, Mark actually likes this guy too. It's not just a weird outlier in the numbers, because there's been so many cases of weird outliers in the numbers sometimes that you just start to hear footsteps.
I love self-awareness in guys. Like every guy that's made it to the league, most of them have been the best player on every single team they've played on. And when they get to the league, they're not going to be that. Like they're going to have to fill a different piece of the puzzle. And so like guys that know exactly what piece of the puzzle they're filling, they're enthused about filling that piece of the puzzle. Like I love that stuff. And his film, his process always pops because he's never making selfish plays. And to me, like the idea of having self-awareness, being enthused about your role, it always shows up in selfish plays. My college coach used to say every turnover is from either a selfish play or a careless play. And to me, you see so many guys in the league that are making selfish plays with turnovers because they're trying to get theirs. They're trying to establish who they are in the league and all these other things. And when it comes to Hardenstein, I never see selfish plays from him, whether it's offensive rebound, kick out immediately, whether it's in the pocket. Like if he's supposed to finish, he finishes with a floater. Like if he's supposed to pass, he passes. And like, to me, that's the thing that no matter what the numbers say, I don't look at the numbers first. I always look at the film and like what the player looks like first. And then I'll go and try to like see, oh, does this match? And if it doesn't match, like I'll be like, well, let's look again. Everything matches with him. It all pops, film and numbers, it all pops. And I just love his self-awareness and how he plays the game.
We should do something on the Film Plus Numbers All-Stars. He would be on there. I wonder who else would be in that conversation.
Luke Cornett would be on there.
Luke Cornett, yes.
Yes, Luke Cornett would be on there. I think Jacob said we're working on the Danny Green All-Stars. So I think the Danny Green. The Danny Green All-Stars are like we call them the process All-Stars. The film plus the numbers, like those, they're the Danny Green All-Stars. So I like it.
I love that.
Neil, we'll get you out of here on this one. Do you have an MVP pick? You have Raptor. You have estimated Raptor going. Do you have a side of the aisle that you're ready to stand on when it comes to the NBA MVP pick?
I was just thinking about how like every day when I update this ranking, it feels like either SGA or Jokic like switch spots, and nobody else is even close. I think that's kind of the consensus and has been for the past couple of years anyway. But it's not just like a stats thing. But more of just like, yeah, these two guys are kind of clear cut 1-2 in some direction or 1A, 1B, whatever you want to call it. The update today had SGA. If you ask me tomorrow, it'll probably be Jokic. I don't know if they play tonight, but you get the idea. So yeah, I don't know. I do feel like, you said something about, the phenomenon of SGA and maybe it is a little bit of like an automatic thing that people do too much of like, okay, if you're the best player on the team with, I guess Cleveland has are one game ahead, but like generally they've been the team with the best record. If you're that player, traditionally that gets you the MVP. It didn't help Tatum last year, which I think was a little bit of a special case. But in an era where there's this talking point that like, oh, the NBA is so boring, and there's teams are playing the same, and it's so cookie cutter, that we can have the two best players in basketball be super great, historically great in terms of their numbers, and then also be just about as different as in playing styles as two. But I'll take Jokic. I feel like you want to hear this. I want to say it. I'm going to take Jokic, and I like because I would have given SGA the MVP last year, then it would not be part of MVP fatigue for me with Jokic. So I'm free to take Jokic this year.
There you go. Let your conscience be free, Neil. Let it fly. All right, man. Well,
what about you though?
I'm Jokic through and through. Like, there's no doubt about it. Okay. To me, it's pretty clear cut. It's not that I don't think SGA is incredible, and being one of the top players in the league is no feat to scoff at. Like, he's truly remarkable, and he is incredibly valuable. It's just he's not the most valuable. Like, there's no other player, voting fatigue be damned. There's no other player that unlocks or maximizes more of his teammates than Jokic. And that's no slight at SGA for me. So to me, I think SGA is great. I'm so excited to see what he looks like in the playoffs this year with Hartenstein and with a few rounds of reps under his belt of being the main guy, because last year was his first time. But it's not really a particularly difficult decision for me, and that's no slight at SGA at all.
Yeah, well, I think in the betting markets, last I checked, SGA was favored, but let me just
are the betting markets so for somebody you're more educated than I am, so I feel comfortable asking you this. Are the betting markets for awards just like a huge psychology experiment? Because the awards are not based on anything other than 100 people's opinions. So isn't it just like an exercise in can you predict groupthink? We had Matt Moore on the podcast a few weeks ago, and he talked about how almost every MVP award, but maybe 3 or 4, 95% of the votes have gone to the consensus MVP. So is it more of is Vegas being able to be more predictive of who is the actual MVP, or who do these 100 people think will vote for this person?
I definitely think that it's the latter. They're trying to kind of read the tea leaves of what the consensus of the media is going to be, rather than who they think is the MVP. Now, it's like a weird thing where it's okay, you would think the consensus of the writers and whoever else votes would then be correlated with who the most valuable player is. So then if you're trying to predict that, and you've got all kinds of different ways in which I remember the odds, you wouldn't think that it would matter, but the whole narrative around Embiid versus Jokic a couple of years ago with the whole Kendrick Perkins and yes, all the talk there, that shift, the bettors were on it. I was surprised that you could see the odds shift from Jokic to Embiid when that particular narrative got momentum. So I think it's actually trying to kind of identify narratives that will end up being dominant, because writers love telling stories, and that's kind of what we're looking for when we're trying to piece together. And we're all doing it all the time, just in general as humans. But especially when we're trying to tell stories about basketball and about the arc of a season, we're trying to latch on to what's something that's easy to explain or kind of fits some kind of pre-existing arc that we want to be able to tell a story around. And so I think that they're trying to latch onto whatever narrative will be the dominant one. And in this case, I think it is the SGA, okay, last year was his big coming out party as an MVP type player, and OKC was young and they weren't ready for the prime time in the playoffs. But now they've shown that they have staying power. They're just as good, if not better. SGA continues to improve. we're also tired of Jokic. You joked about voter fatigue, but I think voter fatigue is as much of a factor in the history of NBA voting, MVP voting, as any other factor.
Yeah.
And you just have to look at like Charles Barkley, God bless him. He probably shouldn't have won in 93, but Jordan had already won so many. Karl Malone in 1997 got it because they were tired of giving it to Jordan. Shaq only had, I think, one MVP in his career because they were just like, it's boring to give it to this big guy that's so plainly dominant every single year. So and LeBron, he could have been MVP like 5, 6, 7 straight years if you'd just been going straight off of performance rather than kind of like, oh, Derrick Rose, it's so exciting to see him kind of emerge this year in the Bulls. A little bit similar, I think, of like the SGA, like, okay, here's the new thing that we want to direct our attention to because this team is doing well and they have a great, exciting lead guard. So all of that is to say that if you could predict narratives and voter fatigue, you'll probably do a great job of betting on the MVP, I think.
It's narrative season, baby. Coronation time.
It's all narratives.
Yeah. So, Neil, thank you so much for coming on. Thanks for giving us time. Neil Paine, Substack. We are writing college basketball this year leading up to March Madness on ESPN. You do a NASCAR pod. You're the most versatile guy in the sporting world. Thank you so much for giving us your time, Neil Paine.
Well, thank you for having me, Mark. I appreciate the kind words as always.